I just think that when hard things happen to you in life, it's like change the questions, right? What is happening here for me? And like try to hold that duality of like, yes, this is awful. This is hard. I don't want this to be here and allow yourself to feel that. But can you also not just fixate on like the door that is closing, but also the other ones that are opening? Because there is a duality that exists in life. And I think we really see that in these harder experiences.
Hello, and welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. This podcast is about exploring the grief that occurs at different times in our lives, in which we have had major changes and transitions that literally shake us to the core and make us experience grief. I created this podcast for people to feel a little less hopeless and alone in their own grief process as they hear the stories of others who have had similar journeys. I'm Kendra Rinaldi, your host. Now, let's dive right into today's episode. I have been asked by many people what I use to record my podcast. I have been using Zencaster since I launched my podcast in March 2020, and it has made it so simple for me to be able to interview my guests remotely as well as do some of my solo episodes. If you have thought about podcasting before and realize that you need a lot of different tools and services, those days are over. With Zencastr's all in one podcasting platform, you can create your podcast all in one place and distribute to Spotify, Apple, and any other major destination. Go to zencaster.com/pricing and use my code GGG podcast, and you'll get 30% off your first month of Zencaster's paid plan. That is Zencaster, ZENCASTR.com/pricing. And again, the code is GGG podcast. Can't wait for you to get started and be able to tune into your next podcast. I'm chatting with Emily P. Bingham today. She is a certified grief educator, a grief coach, a widow, and the founder of Move Through. And she is also an author. Her book, Love and Grief: Finding Healing, Meaning, and Purpose in Life After Loss, is her newest or first book?
Yeah.
First book, yes?
Yes, first book.
Yes, first book. Ever since I've had the podcast, I've been following your story on Instagram and your own journey since Ian's passing in 2019. And your own transparency and your vulnerability on Instagram has been very admirable and reached out to so many and touched so many hearts. So thank you for that, Emily, and welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much, Kendra. I love being here. It's an honor.
I'm grateful that you're here. So I always start this way, just like in a regular casual conversation. Where do you live and where did you grow up?
So I'm living in Denver, Colorado. We actually just moved to a neighborhood that is legitimately right next to the university where Ian and I met. So it's been a fun synchronicity. But I grew up in Durango, Colorado, which
So
is
you're
like
from
6 hours
Colorado.
south. Yeah.
And when you were married to Ian, you were living in Hawaii when you guys, yes?
Well, no, so we
No.
were
Okay.
actually it was we were kind of all over the place. We were living in San Diego
Okay.
when his cancer metastasized. And then we had to move to Colorado because I had one young kid and then I was pregnant with the other, and we needed help because we were receiving treatment in Texas at MD Anderson because his
Okay.
cancer was so rare. And that's where we could get alternative therapies. And then we flew back to Hawaii, which is where Ian is originally from, for his passing. And
Okay. So it was after he passed, that's where you spread his ashes. Was that part? Okay. So you were not living there when he passed. You went back.
yeah. Mhm.
Okay, that part. And then from there, then you went back home after. to Colorado
Yeah.
after, yes?
Yeah,
Okay.
came back home. I needed my family, so that's where
Okay.
we
That part of like, oh wait, I saw the part of Hawaii and then going back and I guess I got lost in the
confusing.
story. So the book is not only a memoir, but it's a tool book. It is so well written and just has so many. It's beautiful and it's easy to read. You share like at the beginning of a chapter, you share a little bit about your life. Then you do the parts of sharing things like sometimes uh, stigmas about grief or myths about grief or things that are out there, as well as then your own research about grief, because now you're a grief educator yourself and coach. And you also then share reflections for the reader to be able to
Mhm.
approach and do themselves. How was it for you writing this book and shedding more of your own life on the pages?
Yeah, it was a definitely a journey. I mean, the way that I've gone about that I went about writing the book as well as creating any of my coaching programs is I take my personal experience. So I kind of go back in my mind and it was like what was this obstacle that I had to overcome? And the first one was really like how to cope with grief. Like how do I deal with these really big emotions? So in the book I kind of share about how I was feeling, what I was experiencing, everything I was moving through and what I did to support myself during that time. And so that could include anything like books that I read, quotes that inspired me, tools that I started to develop, right? So I think that stories are so powerful because people can feel seen in them. So I think through my social media content and also in my book, people can relate to the story and then they have the tangible tools then that also supported me in my own journey. And, you know, I try to present them as a buffet of options because grief is so unique for everyone. What worked for me might not be supportive for you, and it also changes at different stages of the journey. I tried to kind of go back over the course of my grief journey from the early grief to the okay, wow, I'm starting to grow through this, and what are how are the tools and the lessons and insights kind of changing there into like okay, who the heck am I now? And figuring out my identity, right? So the challenges continued to evolve and change as I did. And so, yeah, I think the book kind of weaves those two really like practical, applicable tools and insights and lessons alongside like the story, which is, it was a fun way of putting it all together.
Yes, no, it's really good. And then I was asking you right before we started recording that I wanted to ask you regarding when Ian was sick and navigating grief even then, because you were expecting a child and then that process. And you said, "Oh, wait, I could get that part into the book because there's a certain limit." So I'm like, "Oh, well, now I want to know that part and let's share it with the audience." So when when Ian was diagnosed was in 2017, was it 2 years of his process? Tell us a little bit about his journey.
Yeah, so Ian was actually diagnosed when we were like 22, I think.
Oh,
We
okay.
yeah, he had a long diagnosis and ironically, we had been on a break since college. He was pursuing his career, I was pursuing mine, and then one day I got a call saying, "Hey, I just found out that I have uveal melanoma, this like super rare cancer." And in a nutshell, that experience kind of brought us back together. We moved in together in Miami, and he started receiving treatments for the tumor then. But it was we were young and we were like, "Oh, it's going to be fine, you know, like treat the tumor and we're good." And so we just kind of proceeded with life. We started our family and then you're right, in 2017 is when it metastasized. And I would say that's really where my grief journey began. And I would have loved to have put it in the book, but just didn't have enough space. So
That's
yeah,
the
and
sequel or
yeah,
prequel.
the
We could call that
prequel.
one the prequel.
But yeah, anticipatory grief is a journey in itself, and I really have a lot of compassion and empathy for people who have been dealing with diagnosis over multiple years, just not just for the patient, but also for the caretaker, because you lose your person before they actually die. Ian definitely changed. He wasn't able to do the same things physically that he was able to do, and that included just playing with our kids, helping around the house, and doing things that we used to enjoy together, right? You kind of lose like your best friend. Instead of being able to go to the beach together, we were going to the hospital for scans and treatments, and that would make him sick. So it's like there's this massive loss of life as you knew it. And the way that I like to compare that, what I like to compare that to is during the pandemic. We all lost that normalcy, and that kind of gives you a taste for what it's like, how your life changes so much when you're with someone with a terminal illness. So you have the grief of the loss of normalcy, but then there's also the anticipatory grief where you're facing this imminent death. Like when someone's terminal, you know that their time is running out. And it's tricky because Ian didn't want to hear his prognosis. He didn't want to know how much time he had left. And, you hear stories where people will say, oh, it's 1 month and then they live another year, or, you have another year and then they die in 1 month. So it's hard to know, but it really does feel like you're kind of living in quicksand. Like there's no stable ground. You're just in this limbo. It's really hard to plan ahead. And I think the lesson there is, how do we stay more present? How do we make the most of the time that we do have, knowing that the only certainty is now? And that mindset really, really saved us during that period of anticipatory grief. And I think it's a lesson that I've carried into my life moving forward whenever I've had to navigate uncertainty and fear, because our life is one big unknown, let's face it. Like tomorrow isn't guaranteed. So by bringing awareness to the presence, focus to the presence, it's like this is it. That's where we can
Mhm.
find our power.
Yes. And how did you choose as a couple then? Because you had Izzy already then at that moment when
Mhm.
his metastasized, and you were pregnant at that moment with Theo, or did you choose to get pregnant right before he started treatment? How was that? How was that
Yeah.
process? And then knowing, again, like you said, that knowing that you were had a big chance that you were going to be raising two kids on your own at that
Yeah.
moment as your husband's navigating this uncertainty. How did you guys come to that decision as a family?
Well, that's the thing. When I married Ian knowing that he had cancer, but I don't know if it, and I've reflected on this a lot. I'm like, was I just in complete denial of the fact that bad things can happen to people? Or was I just so young and naive and like blindsided by the love that I felt for him to marry someone with a terminal illness? I guess at the time it was just an eye tumor and I thought he's going to be fine, and it was stage 1, it wasn't terminal. So we got married, we had our first kid, and then we were trying to get pregnant for the second time, and so we did it intentionally, but it wasn't until the after I got pregnant with our second that we found out that it was terminal, that it had metastasized. So, it's an interesting question. Would I have changed my would I have changed anything had I known that it was terminal or not? I think there were implications regarding pregnancy when what if you were on treatment or something, but um yeah, it's hard to play that to go back
Yeah,
in time and
because
ask myself that, but
well,
um
it goes into that, even one of the parts that you even mentioned in the podcast, the should've versus could've. Is that, wait, let's see. Is
mhm,
that the
yeah.
one? Shoulda, right? So even in that, it's like I could have, I should have, I did. Even within your life, you could have, should have, could have, but then really, like, your life wouldn't look like it does now. And
Right.
something you say right at the beginning of your book is that you are actually a better human being who you are now based on your experiences. So you actually do a statement that says, hold on, I wrote it down if I can. I am better for it. So let's talk about that. How had those experiences, because you had mentioned in the beginning, you had not really experienced hard things in your life before. And as you said, you were probably like, oh, that happens to other people. That's an other people thing. Right? And then all of a sudden it's like, no, 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 no. Here you go. You know, and not just cold water with lots of ice on it, and then this and all this. A big, big bucket of water came down pouring on you with this life instance. So tell us, how is it that you are better for it
for it.
because of it?
Yeah, it's so funny. I totally had the mindset of like, yeah, yeah, people I like hear stories of people dying of cancer and I'd be like, well, that's sucks for them. Like I don't know, it just like didn't dawn on me that it could happen. And I think that is one of the ways that I am better for it is compassion for others, you know? But I think in general, the way that I look at these knees on the ground moments, right? The moments that break you entirely open and shatter everything that you knew about the world to be true. I mean, that is what happened to me with Ian's death. Like, I remember telling one of the doctors, "You cannot let him die," as if I had any control over that any of us had control over the experience, right? So I think what happens is you're broken open, and as you begin to pick up the pieces, right, you grow and you expand. And I have a chapter in there that talks about growth happens in the void, right? It happens in the space in between figuring out how to adapt from what is to what is to, I'm sorry, to what was, to what is, to what will be, right? So you're kind of forced to get a little more recess or resource oriented, solution oriented. You're forced to learn new things, to take on new roles and responsibilities. And none of this is anything that we asked for, right? But in that process, we stretch and we grow, we become more resilient, we become more capable. And I think as you start to reflect on your growth, it's like, wow, how much more potential is there within me? It's like there's this I kind of feel like unstoppable in a weird twisted way. And I think it does really force you to question some of the old paradigms. I used to think that happiness was about the white picket fence, the family, my partner, and having somewhat of like a stable job, income, and that whole paradigm was shattered. So really having to ask myself the hard questions about what matters to me, what is my truth, what is joy, happiness, success, and fulfillment in life look like for me. And I absolutely believe that that process has made me a much better person.
Yeah, and the part of the empathy, like you said, the growth, the part that now you yourself have experienced something, have now been able to also help your children
Hmm.
navigate grief as well. Izzy was super little and you were very open and frank. The words you used were straightforward as to what had happened to dad, and then her, process as a 3-year-old in that moment was just so beautiful, I and touching, and to see. And so your resilience as an adult going through this process, but seeing now that your children have a different upbringing, right? As with
Yeah,
resilience, and they now see differently than you did, of things do happen to
right,
to
right.
people. So that's going to be an interesting dynamic to kind of
Yeah,
as a journey as a mom to navigate
totally.
grief with them.
Yeah, and I don't sugarcoat it. Like I think one of the hardest parts of this experience was that I feel like I like lived in a bubble my entire life, right? Where bad things don't happen. And then when they did, it was like such a shock to my system. And I think it can put a lot of us in this like victim mindset of like, well, why me? Why did this horrible thing happen to me? Like bad things aren't supposed to happen in our life. And it's like, wake up, guys. Shit happens all the time. And and I guess I just kind of want to raise my kids with that mentality, and I don't think it's going to traumatize them. I just don't feel the need to protect them from the realities of life. Let's normalize death. Let's normalize cancer and hardship and struggle and teach them, give them the skills to move through these experiences that are inevitable. I think they're just as valid as the joy and the happiness, right? Like it's all there
Yes,
for us. And if anything, they amplify those
those
lighter
other moments.
moments.
Yeah, that's one of the things I realize is that with grief, like I feel that It it's as if it sharpens this lens in which we look through life. I
Mhm.
remember when I've experienced grief very vividly, in that moment that everything just looks so much brighter, like colors are brighter, sounds are more,
Mhm.
like you're so much more aware and present
Yeah,
when you're in the thick of grief. Like you're right, it just
right.
amplifies all these other emotions.
Yeah, and I think it's grief, it's the fact that we can lose, like, the idea that nothing is for granted, right? I think we fall into this trap of complacency and that and taking life for granted when it's and then when you see it as, like, we don't know. I think we do tend to savor the moment a little bit more. I
Mhm.
mean, and I think
Yeah.
that I think about that in Ian's cancer journey. I think about it, like it did, like you said, like the colors, like I feel like that time it was horrible and like we were living in full saturation. We took trips together, just tasting food together, sitting on the deck and soaking in the sun,
Mm.
right? Like it makes me want to cry about it because it's so beautiful.
Mhm.
But when we don't have the hard conversations and talk about death, hardship, cancer, all these things, right? It's like then it's just kind of like living life in monotone because that's all there is. Happiness doesn't feel as elated unless you have the gravity of grief or sadness to give it that range.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, it gives that contrast. Now you say something, and as we're talking about this in the book called grief, that we live in a grief adverse society.
Mhm.
So, in general, we're in a society in which we don't talk about grief. If we talk about even death itself, like talking about our own mortality is so taboo in so many cultures and countries. Like it's as if you're calling it upon you when
Right.
we know it's guaranteed that we're not going to be here forever. Yet talking about it already is taboo. So, we do live in a culture in which seeing people sad, it was like, "Oh, but be happy, like,
Right.
people want to cheer you up." So how was it then for you as you were in the thick of then the grief and the emotions with the people around you? How were you able to also set your boundaries? Because you were your own grief coach first, as
Yeah.
you even say it technically, and saying to people, really, this is what I need. These are my boundaries. And you talk about this in the book of how to teach others to be an advocate for themselves and their grief.
Yeah.
So share about yourself in that aspect.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, this was the big first loss. I mean, I was like the only 32-year-old, right? Not many 32-year-olds lose their husbands. So in my friends group, I felt like it was kind of like the elephant in the room. Like no one really wanted to talk about it. It was like people would call me and be like, "Hey, how are you?" And I'd be like, "I'm doing okay." And then I'd be like, "Oh, like, you wanna go get tacos or something?" Like, I don't know, it just felt, like, so obvious that they didn't know how to approach the subject with me in many ways, um, and and that can feel really hard, and I think in early grief, I just kind of distanced myself from a lot of people of my immediate friend group and really focused on connecting with other grievers who got it, where I could feel seen, so I think, connection and community are 2 key pillars that I also highlight in the
Two
group.
of your C's, 2 of your
Yeah.
C's from the 6 that you have
'Cause
in the book.
it can be really hard when you're, like, already just, like, so raw and open, and to have that. I also had to do a lot of educating for myself first and foremost, so thank God we have, like, the internet, and you can literally learn about grief or pick or find a book or a podcast or something to educate, yourself about it, and so that's what I did, and as I learned more about my feelings and that it was okay to feel this way, it was normal, and the best way for me to move through this experience was to learn how to like I like to say that it's not grief that's the problem, it's our relationship to it. So if you can learn to embrace grief and just not make your emotions right or wrong and just ride the waves as they come, that helped me a ton, and so then I had to communicate mainly to my parents. I think my mom got it more than my dad, who comes up from a little bit more of the tough love, "All right, suck it up, let's go, like, life keeps moving, you're a single mom now, and your kid's dad already died, so they need you," and I was like, I'm sorry, but I am not capable of being a mom right now," like, so I learned how to ask for help from them. I had to learn how to set boundaries and say, "Yes, I wanna be a good mom, but in order for me to do so, I also need a lot of space right now to feel what I need to feel, to go work out, to just sit by a lake in silence and have nobody touch me or talk to me," right? Like,
Yeah.
so part of it was learning to get to know what I needed so that I could communicate it to them, and if there was pushback, I would literally say, "I am sorry, but I do not have space for anything but unconditional love and support
Mm.
right now. If you cannot help me and respect this boundary, then I will find somebody else who can." And that was really hard to do to but I think I was just out of F's to give, for
Mm.
lack of better word. Like, I was like,
Wait,
"This
is
is
that the
fine."
other chapter, the 6 Fs?
That's something one
Yeah.
of my clients says all the time. She's like, "I'm just out of." But it's something I mean, that's part of our growth too, right? Is learning
Mhm.
how to identify what we need and to go out there and actually get it and to communicate to other people who might not understand. And typically people do come around.
And it's so true because even as someone that's experienced grief and that I am also a grief coach and things like that, the calling or wanting to approach someone that's in the moment of grieving, you do not you kind of feel like you're walking on broken glass and like, okay, do I mention something? What if they're not in that space in that moment to want to share? The asking the how are you doing is like it's like how are you doing the second really like because it's not right and not a general question,
Mhm.
but it is hard even sometimes as some you probably even see this yourself. It's because
Yeah.
grief experience is so unique to the individual. It's like you don't know even how to approach someone that's grieving in a way that may be beneficial or appropriate for them as
Right.
well. So sometimes even I feel like being completely honest, like I messaged someone that had a loss and I said, I wanted to check in how you guys were doing. If by chance me asking you how your grief is journey is too intrusive, please tell me. If you don't want to talk about it, tell me. I won't
Yeah.
ask. Like just but I do want to them to know that I've been thinking of them in
Right.
that aspect, right? How do you feel it's the best way that you've noticed now as you're supporting someone else that you approach a conversation regarding grief in someone else's grief
Yeah.
journey?
I think it never hurts to ask. I know I've had some friends who've experienced some recent losses, and I think the acknowledgement is there, and like you said, like show them that you're thinking of them, offer options, right? Like I think it's hard to say when you tell a griever, "Oh, anything you need, just let me know." They don't know. So if you can give options, like, you want to if you want a shoulder to cry on, I can pick up some groceries. Two options.
Two options, 2 day. If you want
Right.
visitors, I can come Wednesday or Tuesday,
Right.
morning, night. Yeah,
Or
like
or
give be
or, like, I mean, in early grief, like, for me, I loved it when people just showed up and just did it. It was like, take a chance, buy some groceries, leave them at the door, like,
yeah.
anything, but, yeah, I think, also telling a griever, like, "You don't have to respond,
Mhm.
just want you to know that I'm thinking of you," just that permission, I think, is a really big
Mhm.
piece, that if people want to, like, back out or not be talking about it, then th th that's a nice way to relate to a griever, I think.
Mhm. Yeah,
But it is really
even if
different for everyone.
it is, yeah, even if you send a little emoji with a heart, like, that's even if you don't know,
Yeah.
like, what to say, just send them a little emoji.
Like,
That's
honestly, Kendra, I get a little bit apprehensive when, there's a couple of I've seen it and I've probably written about it myself, but when we say, like, what not to say to a griever,
Yes, yeah.
I'm like, let's not create more tension around like all the triggering things that people say,
Mhm.
right? Because I do think that people are really genuinely trying their best to support
Agreed.
people. And it's also part of the job of the griever, you know, to see it within themselves that like that they're being activated too, right?
Mhm.
And how can we kind of just let that go, kind of let it
Mhm.
melt away, because trusting that most people are trying their best. And that's hard to do when you're in early grief. That's easy for me to say 5 years later, but I just tried to kind of in general, like, just kinda let it go because
Yeah, no, you're right, because the thing is that there's sometimes not anything that you're going to say that might be right, because again,
there's
you do not
nothing.
know. You don't know how the person's gonna be. So just the fact of showing up in itself is
Yeah.
something. One of the guests I had, an author, Rabbi Steve Leader, said that just the best way to support is, just show up and be you. Like That's be you. Like,
I like
support
that.
in the way that you are, like, who are you? And then in that way you support. Like, if I say,
Mhm.
"What would you like me to cook?" And have no clue. I don't even know how to coo let's say I order In-N-Out burgers for my kids every day, and all of a sudden I'm offering to make you a casserole, like, it would be like that's not by the way, that's not a reality. I'm just giving that as an
Yeah,
example.
yeah.
It would not be true to who I am, right? So what is the
Right.
best way that you as an individual can support someone else based on who you are? So, yeah, just show up.
Yeah.
That's all it
Show
that's
up
all
in
that
whatever capacity that you
with other
can, and
capacity.
if you say something that pisses off the griever, it's probably bound to happen, but it's
Yeah.
better than doing nothing.
Yes. So now that we're talking about pissing off, let's talk about your Instagram and your vulnerability on Instagram. One, how much it actually touched so many people, and your posts, people can relate to your grief, but also how do you navigate then the people that do not like to see grief displayed and how they react to your grief
Yeah.
being put on display per se?
Yeah, I'd say the 2 most triggering topics that really seem to, um ignite a lot of I guess, trigger people essentially are probably around dating and love after loss. That feels like a really hot topic that people don't seem to understand. And then, yeah, finding the good. Like said in some of my posts that my husband's death has been the worst thing that's happened to me and also the best because of all of the growth that I experienced. And, you know, it's what happened for me, my process when I get negative feedback, and it can be from, a troll, which I usually just try to ignore because they're just trying to like get under anyone's skin. But if it's like, I've had other widows come at me and tell me their point of view, and I'm like, that's fair. I'm putting it out here, right? To help people, and it's clearly going to turn some heads. And part of my job is to also listen and get curious about what is my response. So if I'm feeling activated by something that they're then saying, I'm like, oh, like I've been told that at times that I've exploited my husband's death by sharing our story. And so like I'm like, all right, well, internal check if this is triggering to me, then there's got to be some part of me that believes that this is true, right? So then I start to really like look at my post, what I'm doing, how I'm talking about it, and I kind of give myself that gut check, do I still feel in alignment with everything that I am sharing? And I just kind of say yes, or maybe there's a little bit of no, and I start to change. But and then I'll respond to them accordingly, but I have for a while, I really dimmed my light because I felt like I was doing my grief wrong. I felt like I needed to play into this narrative of tragedy and suffering, and my life is going to suck forever. And I think the past 2 years I've really said screw that, that's not me. Like this is my experience, and it's okay if it's different from yours. And actually now it's on you to see why my what I am saying is so triggering to you, and it's likely because they can't find that light, that love within themselves. But it's hard and it's a constant process, but I am of the mindset that everything in life is there for us. So if I get a negative comment, I'm like, all right, well, I'm going to get curious about this. What is this teaching me? What is this showing me? And
Curiosity, yeah,
yeah,
and you talk about
exactly.
curiosity, getting curious and your grief a lot in your book as well. You have a curiosity versus what was the other curiosity and oh, that's one of your C's, right?
Yeah,
Is
curiosity is
yeah,
mercy.
yeah. I was like, wait, what was that part? Yeah, it was one of your C's. The part of putting ourselves out there and like you said, sharing your perspective and your journey. Yes, there's going to be people that don't relate to that way,
Mhm.
but there's going to be a lot that do, and maybe not even a
Mhm.
lot. Maybe if it is one,
One.
again, one. But what that does to that one person, and it is not one. If you see how many followers Emily has, you'll know it's not just one person that relates to her story, by the way. But but the that person and how that person feels seen
Mhm.
in someone, it's like, oh, okay, so I shouldn't feel guilty that I feel like, some sense of peace now that my
Mhm.
loved one is resting finally, and
Yeah.
cancer is one of those things that it is. having lost my mom from cancer as well. It's one of those things that makes you wish they were not living anymore because their pain is so hard. It does
Mhm,
make you wish their death. It is
mhm,
very hard to say. And it's hard even right now as I'm
mhm,
saying it because you do not want to see them suffer anymore, right?
mhm.
So for someone else to hear someone's perspective like yours on Instagram, in your book, it's going to relate to someone
Right,
else's story. And that is so important. Like you said at the beginning of this conversation, stories are the ones that really do connect us. It connects to the humanity that we are and to other souls because it's so
totally.
easy to just say all the good stuff and the
Right.
fluff and what other people want to hear. But what about the things that people need to hear,
Right.
rather,
And I
right?
love that we have more people now sharing because it is giving there is someone for everyone. Like I now that I've done the work on myself and like I've really realized like you cannot you're not for everyone and that's okay. And the courage to be unliked, that's important. But I'm on the light side of grief and I'm not going to be for everyone. And there's plenty of other people that they can gravitate to and I've accepted that about, you know,
But well, you
putting
came to
myself
the
out
right
there.
yeah, well, you came to the right podcast titled Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between because there is, and sometimes it's like my handle is grief, gratitude. I'm like, I'm not sometimes people are like, well, I'm not grateful, but yes, there is that
Yeah,
gratefulness as well, like you said, of the aspect of having gone through grief because I wouldn't be where I am today had I not
exactly.
experienced that either. So there's yin and yang in life and lots of
It's all
contrast,
in
light and dark.
duality, yeah.
It
It's all
is. There
really
is a
good.
lot of that, and it's beautiful. Now, would you share with us what your life looks like now? Because there's also that part of not only grieving the what life could have looked like, the grief in the present, of course, that the person's going through. You grieve then your past, then you also grieve your future. Now you're right now it's future from from 4 years ago, from when Ian passed. 4 no, 5 years now.
5 years,
5
yeah.
years, gosh. Okay,
Mhm.
5 years ago from when Ian passed, what does your present look like right now, Emily?
So, in terms of grief, and I just wrote a post about this yesterday, um, I don't feel a lot of grief. I mean, and we always talk about there is no end to grief, and I'm starting to question, well, what if there was? Because I'm not actively grieving anymore. That's it. But I do every now and then have a wave, but the waves don't feel like they used to. They feel like even like the week that my book got published, I was so emotional. I cried every day, but it wasn't like I was longing for Ian or missing him. Like I was in so much acceptance of the life that is. I just think that it was like, wow, so much beauty can come from something so awful, and it just brought about this wave of like maybe it was gratitude, maybe it was grief, but yeah, I don't. I think more often than not, I can still feel a lot of sadness these days. I think I feel sadness that Ian didn't get to live out the rest of his life, but I also trust that he's here, in spirit in some capacity. And so I feel excited about that, the magic that exists there. But and then I also, for my kids, I think it's still I was gonna say, like, do I still feel sad that their dad's not here, that they don't get to have that? And it's kind of like a yes and a no, because I guess for them too, I'm in so much acceptance of the life that is. And I think that they're flourishing and we're developing that spiritual connection with their dad. And, I live with my partner, David, and his two kids are with us 50-50, and my kids are getting along with his kids really well, and of course, not all the time, right? But they have a father figure, and who's to say what is the way that it's supposed to be? There is no supposed to be. Like, it all just is. And so, am
It
I
all
making
just is,
sense
and
with
what
that?
yes, of
Like,
course it does make sense. What if this was supposed to be the end of the story and
yes,
you didn't know, we don't know.
we write our
We don't know.
own.
Exactly. We write our own.
And we can either fight with reality and create more suffering for ourselves, or embrace what is, and sometimes that
Mm.
embrace takes time because we are having to let go of something
Mhm.
that was really near and dear that we wanted, and we see that not just in death, we see it in job transitions, kids
Mhm.
going out of the house, any type of disappointment. So, yeah, right now I feel a lot of peace, acceptance, love, gratitude, and I'm human, I have my shitty days, right? Like
The part that you're saying about the not knowing and living life just in the present,
present.
having being grateful for what is right now is so important. And you have expressed so many different aspects of your life in the book, but one thing I want to touch on before we close out is your move through program. Let's talk about that because that was you were a spin instructor. You were a spin instructor and you realized that movement was one of the ways in which you were really kind of pouring out your
Yeah.
grief, and then that's kind of how move through started. So tell us about move through.
Yeah. So right around 6 months after Ian died, I was like, "What am I going to do with my life?" I don't wanna return back to my, like, 9 to 5 job. I'm a solo mom. I can't even, like, do that logistically. So, yeah, I hired a coach, a goal coach. Her name is Jackie Carr. She comes and speaks in my coaching program. She's amazing. And I was like, "Alright, here's what's lighting me up right now. Exercise. It's been the way that I move through grief. I love sharing my story, about loss, and I think I wanna do something to help people." And we just kind of got together and strategized, and Move Through was born. And what that looked like in its infancy was me inviting a group of grievers into the spin studio, turning on some vibey music. Maybe we were going to move through our sadness that day, or we were going to do anger. And I would create a playlist based off of that emotion. And
Was that
also,
all like heavy metal?
yeah, it's like, ah, yeah. And like, no one had to say anything. But what was so powerful is that you would just walk into that room and you would know people, you felt so seen and supported just by being in the presence of other grievers who were moving through something similar. And yeah, it was beautiful. And I did those workouts for maybe only like 4 months because then the pandemic happened and I was like, "Why? What, like, God, universe, what are you doing to me right now?"
Gosh,
Um
another whammy there. Bam.
Right, but then I took it all online, and then as I started sharing my story more and more, I was like, "Oh, people are really actually resonating with what I have to
Mhm.
say. Maybe I can do more programs without the exercise, but also just based on the lessons and other tools that I've been learning." But recently,
Okay.
synchronistically, I just started teaching spin again.
Oh,
So I'm kind of going back to my roots, and because I miss the physicality of it, and yeah,
that is so interesting that you started that, now you're there. So 5 years later, again,
yeah.
now picking it up.
Mhm.
Now what does it look like now? And are you teaching spin, but you're not doing the move through in spin class anymore, or do you still do
Yeah.
some sessions?
I'm not doing the move through in this live classes anymore. I have an online course that has like exercises, like grief-based exercise movements. So there's like an anger workout, a sadness workout, an anxiety workout, but they're not on a spin bike. They're just like weights, or I think for the anger movement we like slam something on the ground, and
Ball
yeah, it's just a
slam,
way to
yeah.
embody
Uh-huh.
the emotion and move it through.
That is
So that's still
so
going
cool.
on. Yeah.
That's so cool. So, how can people reach you then? So, your website is what is your website? They will all be on the show notes down below, but still, can you please share how people
Sure.
can access this information?
So, Move Through Grief, that's Movetru, and then grief.com is my website. I'm also on social media, Instagram, Emily P. Bingham, TikTok. I think I just changed my handle to Emily P. Bingham to make them all the same. I have a Facebook group where you can connect with other grievers under Move Through. And then my book, Love and Grief.
Love and Grief. So, how can people get your book? What are on your website or
Yeah, it's
Amazon,
on my
Barnes and Noble?
website. It's also on my, yeah, if you go to my website, you can like enter in your pay, like the info, and get a free video from me as well where I just talk about the book and other messages of inspiration and hope. And then yeah, it's on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any of those big book retailers.
Is there something I have not asked you that you want to make sure that the listeners hear about
Mm,
grief or about your journey or anything about it or gratitude?
yeah, yeah. I think there's so much I'd like to say. there's I just think that when hard things happen to you in life, it's like change the questions, right? What is happening here for me? And like try to hold that duality of like, yes, this is awful. This is hard. I don't want this to be here and allow yourself to feel that. But can you also not just fixate on like the door that is closing, but also the other ones that are opening? Because there
Mm,
is a duality that exists in life, and I think we really see that in these harder experiences.
perfect. And just navigate the grief waves, but also navigate life in that way, in those waves too, and then just
Mhm.
kinda go with it as well as what I could see from your life. You're just kinda riding each
Flowing
wave
with
as it
it.
comes. You're just going, flowing and moving through, moving through.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that reflection.
Yes, you're moving through life. Yeah, and yeah, you're moving through life, and that is what we do. So thank
Mhm.
you, Emily. Again, this was Emily P. Bingham, and you make sure to get the book Love and Grief and read all her story. And again, there's so much in that book that we did not talk about, of course, here, because we want to make sure that you all go and get it. So thank you again, Emily.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Kendra.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.